Here is an American coming with a French-speaking accent. I hope it will not be too much of a hurdle. I apologize for not speaking Russian. I feel like apologizing also for not being a cultural theorist. Mrs. Prokhorova was kind enough to include me today on the proposal of Professor Tatiana Weiser. And you are going to see a certain shift to maybe a more empirical interpretation of Russian realities on the part of a political scientist who has primarily studied European integration, the US too, and was arrived here in 2000. I came to Russia in 2013 as a highly ignorant person as it comes to Russian politics and society, but keen to learn. And I felt it was a fabulous opportunity. I had applied for a Fulbright to Turkey. I was offered this one, and I thought, yes, if I get to European university, which I did. And I had decided not to write, to simply observe, ask, question. And one encounter prompted me to write. This was the encounter. The rector, Oleg Kakordin, how many of you have read him? Quite a few.
Quite enough.
Yes, maybe too much. What struck me, though, was his attempt to capture what an Arendtian scholar, a scholar of Hannah Arendt, would call the lost treasure of Russian politics. At the same time, I received a call from a very large political science conference. The theme was resurrection. I was simply amazed, and I have put here a sentence. Resurrection is really, can we reanimate, bring back to life some elements of the past, transformed but useful for today? And I asked the organizers, how did you dare to choose such a daring theme, at least for us political scientists? And one, a scholar of the Eurozone crisis, told me, we are tired of just thinking in terms of what doesn't work, of problems. We need some alternatives. So this presentation, in many ways, is not only an outsider's view, but it's also a critique of democratization studies in comparative politics, who use Western concept to study all kinds of other realities, not just Russian, but maybe African countries, Asian countries. And it's also a reaction against sharp binaries. And we talked about this just in the previous presentation, that democratization is very often a process full of gray areas, neither total success nor total failure. So I am going to interpret the term resurrection, reanimation from the past, in three ways. As this lost treasure, as a more Christian understanding, turning away from sin as the individual, and a more collective turning away. Now, Arendt, sorry for the big picture, this book, which is by no means a perfect book, a controversial book, has been a handbook for many dissidents in Eastern and Central Europe. And Arendt critiqued the Americans who have lost the treasure of a revolution and confuse political freedom with free trade or freedom of enterprise. And she sees this as a major problem. She's writing in the 60s. Now, the Christian meaning, I'm sure you know. I have an Orthodox mother. Greek from Constantinople. And so basically what I want to stress here is the embodied material character of a process of resurrection. It's not just about the mind or the spirit. Jesus comes back as a body and preaches action on this earth as a means of salvation. So, going back to Russian literature, Resurrection, a very interesting book on both personal and collective resurrection. You probably have all read the book. You have the turning away from past sin, exploiting the young peasant woman, and then offering her marriage. And there is the turning away from unjustified privileged status by offering land to the peasants. Interestingly enough, the victims of the people both refuse marriage, refuse redistribution of land. And you remember Tolstoy was excommunicated by the church for his sharp critique of his country and the church at the time. Now, I want to talk a little bit about this attempt I observed at European University and beyond to reclaim a certain lost treasure of Russian past. Small spaces, we have talked of autonomous zone. We could say that in the Middle Age, Pskov and Novgorod formed, for several centuries, autonomous zones of semi-liberty, or what people call republicanism. And the sources here, studied by scholars, are the Novgorod Chronicles, and then barge documents, which are just now being excavated in Pskov. So there is still a lot of research going on in both those cities. Some of you talked about the Veche, forgive my pronunciation, as something I think rather negative. Kakordin describes it as those assembly of people who were meeting on the bridge, this is obviously not the same bridge, still, to elect the mayor, also to throw in the river those they had condemned to death, and the process of mediation by the church at time in cases of dispute. And you know, of course, better than I, that this is the two areas which escaped Mughal occupation and for a while Muscovy domination, or Moskova. Now, why do you think that this matters to people who study republicanism at European University? And the seminar of Professor Kakordin is well attended. Well, one of the students who monitored election told me, well, it shows that we have something to cling to in our Russian past. We have something to build on, and that we also had republicanism in medieval times, even if eventually, it was stopped, but it lasted for centuries. So, for example, one application of this complete democracy by Greek standard, using lots to choose people. So, the budget committee at European University is chosen by lots, and according to the rector, there are now several women and young professors on it. So, the kind of plus of using lots. So this young man who was a monitor, this close collaborator of Kakordin, who was a monitor of the election in 2011, 2012, he told me to do a PhD of Pskov, helped him in a way understand what he was doing in a much longer perspective. You may find the perspective too long, but for him and for his peers, it's important. Now here, one thing I found as I talked with people, including many candidates to Fulbright fellowship from their 20s to their 60s, a lot is going on at the provincial and local level. If we are looking for democratization at the federal level, we know that's a question mark. There is a lot going on. So, for example, Čerepovec. It's this committee of 20 citizens. They must not be elected officials. They must not be experts, chosen by lot, who decide how to spend 15 million rubles. Now, rubles from 2012. It's not a huge amount of money, but they made choices to serve civic interest in Čerepovec. So, in some ways, I have tried to show you, how republicanism is reclaimed as a lost treasure to apply today in spaces of freedom in Russia. Now, looking at conversion, you probably know this gentleman who has a controversial reputation, but is a very great scholar of World War II, and of course wrote poetry, plays, etc. My sources there are mostly the book of Orlando Figes, The Whisperers. And he makes of Simonov a case study of both having a Stalin within and freeing himself from it. So, for example, as the head of Novimir, Simonov forbids publication of Pasternak, Dr. Zhivago. However, in 1968, protests the invasion of Czechoslovakia, and will work very hard to have the work of Mandelstam published. Another one, I don't know if you have heard of this DVD, Putin's Kiss. This is amazing story. This young woman, who is now, I think, in New York, was an activist of Nashi. And a Danish film crew decided to observe her in 2010. And as they were filming her and Nashi, she changed her mind because she had moved to Moscow as a privileged child of a regime, met Oleg Kashin, and decided she should withdraw, and became quite loud as a critic. And so this is another case of, in many ways, I would say, personal conversion. Some of my students were telling me, everybody does that. For me, looking at this, I thought it was pretty courageous. So there are those cases which are needed in any movement of social change. Social change include, as Arendt would argue, individual initiative. Several of you have talked about the need to invent a new language. And I was at 2 other lectures, and this is why I could not follow your deliberation yesterday and this morning. But it struck me, in this other conference I was attending, there was very little new language among Russian political scientists. We were mostly talking about post-Soviet time. So Soviet, the word Soviet, set the standard. And I don't pretend at all I have invented a new language. I'm not able to do that. I don't have the knowledge. But nonetheless, I want to use the word thaw, which is often not known among non-Russian experts in the West, to describe this collective turning away from certain stages. Today, this is taken for granted. One looks back and says, of course. I would argue that this was somewhat unexpected. And of course, a mixed movement and very much a top-down movement. And you are all familiar with this. For me, as a newcomer, reading about this, learning about this was very important. and to see the capacity in many ways for some change. I mean, you know better than I, breaking from totalitarianism is no picnic. And Alexander Etkin has written about this quite well, I think, in A Warped Morning. Creating housing which is less confined, where people cannot watch each other quite as well. This book authorized by Khrushchev. And of course, a very ambiguous, incomplete, flawed process. And then we have the years of stagnation. We have this. What is interesting, very few people, I think, you may correct me later, spoke against the Soviet repression of the Hungarian Revolution. Whereas when it comes to the repression of the Prague Spring, it's different. Now I want to argue for a few Western thoughts as a response or a mirror image of Russian or Soviet thoughts. Very often thoughts come as a response to international context. You could say that the American system was frozen into institutionalized racial discrimination through the 60s. And in many ways, you have a first scale of thought, very important, by executive order, so very top-down, affecting the armed forces. By the same token, this thought in Western German politics will affect deeply Eastern and Central Europe, and in many ways provide a new language for Russian dissidents to articulate the critique of the Soviet regime. So we see those movements of thawing in different regimes, which are quite autonomous from each other, but yet affect each other. This is the way it's called. I have not invented anything. You know all about it. What I want to argue about this, it is still a top-down phenomenon, but it is no longer limited to as few agents or initiators than in the 50s. There are many, many more people involved. An interview by Cohen, you may know the interviews of the Glassnut actors. There are books in English on this, or translated from Russian into English. Many more people involved, including many NGOs forming in the late 80s. And of course, the work of Mrs. Prokhorova is part, in many ways, of this movement. What is interesting, Grachev, who was the last spokesperson of Gorbachev, argues that in many ways, quietly within the bureaucracy, there were people thinking of alternatives to the Cold War who then were allowed to start voicing their views and proposing real policies. Whether you agree with my analysis or not, it's important that those scholars who are in some ways quite mainline think that all this has to be respected as self-initiative. Why does it matter to me as an American political scientist? Because so often we hear of the West winning the Cold War. And what those scholars argue is, no, this was a mutual process. This was not win-lose. At best, it was win-win. Now, this is a very Hegelian argument, which in no way intends to tell you that everything will be well in the end, but rather that there are overcoming of negation which give one the sense that the situation is progressing toward more democratization or, to the contrary, regressing. So here is the situation. Again, you know it better than I. On the other hand, I was amazed. I was looking at this movie in a Swiss movie house, Switzerland being my country of origin, and I love looking at the credits. So I wait, I listen to the beautiful music, and I see financed partly by the Russian Ministry of Culture. Again, it shows you a very complex situation. Maybe it was a mistake, but it's, you probably have all seen Leviathan. I would say if there is a third form, there is no way to predict, and maybe another language needs to be invented, it would surely be bottom up and involve many more people. It's interesting, the agility of informal NGOs. I have a friend who has organized one in St. Petersburg, a Russian, of course. And the way she was explaining to me how she had gone around the registration process and still got a lot of things done, publication published, was simply amazing. I found also, contrary to what we hear in the West just now, the diversity of opinion expressed about even the Crimean referendum in conversation, amazing. You know, somebody supporting it. I'm talking of conversation I had last year. But everybody had different ways of justifying their position. So a very great deal of diversity. The same examples through those interviews. I interviewed with others. I was on panels, 3 panels, about 36 candidates to those Fulbright scholarship, from young artists to teachers to architects to, you know, mostly, yes, well-trained people. But for example, one was training people to witness in local government in cases of rezoning, you know, land rezoning. Another creating a different kind of senior nursing home, which would include children, etc., etc. A lot of creativity. And action, Arendt would argue, is a form of language. Now, what I say, this is a slide I show to my Dutch and my American audiences. I have had a few since I have come back last year. And this is something, in many ways, I'm trying to work on. I'm not here talking about distinguished scholars in the West of Russian politics or culture or cultural theory. Obviously, such people know about those things. But in the West, we tend to have, how to put it, simplistic mindset about Russia, you know, unable to be active. We don't know what people went through in the 90s. We have no understanding. We have no sympathy. We just don't know. And we lack constructive imagination. This Pierre Vimont used to direct the foreign affairs program of the European Union, and he denounces this lack of imagination. 1 month ago, I was in Switzerland for a conference on the relationship with Ukraine. And I finally asked the speaker, but what is the proactive view of the European Union toward Russia? And he couldn't answer, but later I had 5 people in this audience, a non-specialized audience, coming and thanking me for my question, saying, yes, this is the question which needs to be answered. So I think we are interdependent, and what we know about each other and what we do affects the possibilities for freedom in our respective autonomous zones. Thank you.
You know, probably it's not an answer, but probably somehow a remark. I think what you're talking about is very important. So just pinpointing this tendency to find some positive cases in the Russian history, showing so this is not a mainstream, not only one pattern that created the postmodern, the contemporary Russia, but there was a number of different cases and experiences all around the territory where could be seen as alternatives to, say, Moscow-type way of governing. And I think that's probably still there is no realization. So nowadays, that's really, we don't have one tradition, but a variety of traditions. And somehow, I think that's very important to shift the optic, because for so many years we had the so-called military state history, where the number of personalities and experience was very narrowed. So I think in many ways that create these booby traps, mental booby traps for any type of protests and creativity. Because whenever people try to find some legitimation for the activity, they still have this only one history with the same characters. Where the major topic is that they have to sacrifice everything for the greatness of the country. And so in this way, showing that we know different types of cities and different types of really this historical experience, it's much easier, you know, to have this different sense of history. And it gives you some historical optimism. Otherwise, we see all this vicious circle, you know, that we just return to the same types of the situation. So in many ways, I think thank you for such a positive view on the situation. Sometimes, you know, being outsider have positive effects. Anyway.
Thank you again for your optimistic outlook. I was very struck by your comment on the conference you took part here in Moscow, that of the scarcity of the language, the terminology used, that it's all played on Soviet, and therefore there are no experiences coming into the conceptual language and conceptualization of the present. And in a way, I could make a bridge between your paper and the paper of the previous paper of Ilya Kalinin, yes. Which was about a diversity of languages. And I think that this diversity is very superficial indeed, because at the basis we haven't made the next step from the Soviet past. When I say we, please, when I speak in plural, please excuse me, because I'm just trying to formulate my thought. I'm not meaning any community in particular, any group in particular, but since you've made this observation, I'm trying to speculate, why is it so? Why is it the case that we're post-Soviet and nothing more? And I think this language is a play of languages that Ilya Kalinin mentioned. It's rather on the surface. It's not analytical. The plurality of languages, they're not analytical. They don't go anywhere into depth. They play on each other. In a way, I would suggest to Ilya another categorical distinction between style and look. Well, Ilya mentioned style, but then he didn't use it in his analysis. It wasn't an analytical category. While I think would be useful to distinguish between style and look. And look is postmodern play on style. Right? It's not something imbued in culture. Right? It's just a play, a stylization rather than style. And perhaps all the languages we had before is a kind of look, making things look like something. It's just an idea. Thank you.
You know, I want to respond to the term optimistic, because optimistic, as I understand it, you know, it's all a question of definition, of course, is thinking everything will turn out for the best. That's not the way, you know, this is not what I meant to say. What I meant to say is that even the fragmented, flawed progress in Russian or Soviet society, and they are flawed elsewhere as well, must not be taken for granted. Some people have talked, you may not agree, but some people have talked of Khrushchev's courage. Now, I know Khrushchev was implicated in Ukrainian repression and all this, you know, and I'm not trying to make him a saint. but it was a break. And when you remember the funeral of Stalin and how people would get hysterical because Stalin had died, and you remember Ulitskaya, the green house, you know, of Ulitsk. She described how people would be trampled to death. So you know, my Russian students, at least at European University, they take for granted the two thoughts. What I'm trying to say, this was not fated. And there were efforts, there was a lot of work in trying to create some openings, thanks to which even we are here today, and I am here today. So you know, it's the same in Western Europe. For example, the phone now may be for you a cliché. You know, we are sick and tired of this term. Okay, I understand. We have a cliché in the West, at least in the European Union. It's called reconciliation. You know, we have reconciled with each other. Now, nobody knows what it's about. And part of my work has been to research this, both theoretically and empirically. The result is young Europeans take completely for granted that, for example, they can move from one country to the next freely. I was telling one of my French students in America, for me it's a miracle that they are not people with guns checking my passport. You know, that's not the way I grew up. This very bright man, 30 years old, told me it wasn't always like that. So what I am trying to do, rather than be optimistic, is try to think of the past in a way which is not faithful, and which, in a way, re-evaluate some of the openings toward partial improvement.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's a pleasure to have you here.